Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for coming along. There's a handout at the front. If you didn't get one, ladies have one on either side, which is just a bit of an intro. And I guess for those of you that don't know me or haven't met me before, I guess we do have to go through a bit of that because, I'm old enough to say I've been on this various and winding path for quite some time. So I'm a bit of a hoarder, I must say, a hoarder of knowledge and practices. Any good ideas I really like to grab a hold of and implement as far as possible on my own farm, which is about an hour west of Dubbo in central New South Wales. So stick your finger in the map. About the centre of New South Wales will do as an approximate guideline for where we're at. And so I'm fourth generation there on the place. My business journey is different than the ecological and social journeys, and so I'll be touching on that because in the end it is always the triple bottom line. And if you're not got that really heading in the direction that you want it to be, then of course we need to adapt. And so what I'll do today too is make sure that we're going along and doing a bit of a thumbnail guide all the time, right? Because this is going to be partly behavioural topics that we'll be covering, as well as no kill. So a bit of a covert thing here. You're going to get a lot more here than just the no kill cropping, but that provides a much greater context for everything that we do. So fourth generation on our place. My wife Roz and three now adult children there are the current custodians of our part of the world. And my journey through this wonderful sort of 35 years, and I really do have to give credit to all of the wonderful people who've bumped shoulders with all over this journey, and some of the major changes that we started to do in the early 90s was ecologically we started to change our grazing management system, and that led to much more productivity. We basically tripled our stocking rate, which is quite significant, and decreased our costs. So that was a big business breakthrough. And while at the same time, the ecology and diversity out in our paddocks began to rapidly increase, so there's the ecology side, and I was being lazier about what I needed to do on the farm. So I had more time off farm, which led me to, first of all, having an independent position in Landcare as a conservation grazing officer, where I was one of the very few ever to provide independent advice on all the grazing systems. So that was really great, but that brought me into a whole world of behavioural science, which continues on today, and we'll talk about self-herding as a bit of a thing a little bit later on, and how we shape our landscapes by doing behavioural change, not only of the animals, but also of us as well. So this journey's gone along and enables me. Most of my time nowadays is spent off farm, actually, away across Australia, not only in the agricultural areas but also in the pastoral zones, which is a great favourite of mine. So the large pastoral stations and that sort of thing of the centre in Western Australia and so forth, spend a lot of time travelling out there with behavioural stuff. So without going further into my resume, because I really want to make this talk more about your interest, so that the title has brought you in here about no-kill cropping. Okay, so first distinction here today, we'll be talking about systems, okay? And your questions, and I'll welcome them all, might be on practices that you are doing, right? But we really need to understand that we're talking about a quite different system. And sometimes I'll get faced with people saying, "Oh, well, look, it's pretty much the same as direct drilling or intercropping or oversowing or pasture cropping or cover cropping, right?" Well, the main thing to point out is, well, you don't put diesel in a petrol car and vice versa, do you? So it's just important to know that there are different toolboxes that you can use, because then you've got the choice of choosing which system and which parts out of each of those systems you wish to apply on your own property. So no-kill came out of our evolvement of a real watershed moment where we had changed our grazing system in the early 90s, one of the first adopters of adaptive grazing management in those days in our part of the world. And we saw this massive increase in production, as well as our paddocks going to great diversity. But then we were still cropping and taking it down to essentially ground zero. We'd been doing 10 years of direct drilling. So the definition of direct drilling is a single pass and soil disturbance. So that's the official, if you like, definition of what you'd like to see, because I don't have a photo to show you where it was, but just one pass, sowing the crop in. Depending upon what the year was, we might do a so-called selective spray, but really a broad spectrum spray that would take out broadleaf weeds that would occur in our cereal crops. So that's what we've been doing for 10 years, but they were faced with the choice that our grazing management was taking our paddocks like this, but then we were taking them with our cropping back down to ground zero again. So we really had a choice there. Are we going to continue that forever, that sawtooth pattern of improving the paddocks and seeing them visibly improve greatly, and then take them down in a major disturbance down to nothing and regrow again? My decision was I was going to burn all the bridges. So I sold all the farming equipment. We had headers and trucks and the whole thing. Did the real radical thing, which I don't recommend actually when I'm out doing my advisory, only from the point of view that, of course, it didn't give me any choice, because I felt so strongly about that. Well, either I'm going to choose a conventional way, or we're going to have to go to something different. And there wasn't anything immediately apparent. We just jumped into the unknown at that point. So no-kill cropping came out of that. Oh, sorry, that would be my phone. So black mark against me. And there's a few people here. So how many do I have a shout at the pub? That's a bit frightening. So we developed no-kill cropping. It was interestingly at a similar time that Cole and Seiss and co were developing up pasture cropping, just a little bit down the road from us, a couple of hours away from where we lived. But so you can understand the systems difference. The boys there, Cole and Daryl Clough, who co-developed it, were thinking along the lines of how could they grow a crop and keep the perennials there in their system. That was the real impetus and baseline, and that's where pasture cropping evolved out of. But we came at it from our system from a different point of view. How can we grow crops without killing everything? Because essentially what we were trying to get at was keep the cake and put cream on top of it. If that makes sense. Yeah? Okay, so any thing that simplified it was taking away something in order to produce something else, which is our systemic issue. If we think about, for all grain growing, can all systems, with the exception of no-kill, all have in them simplification of one type or another. So I'm not being judgmental when I say that, because they're quite successful, aren't they, in terms of grain production. Okay, can't be denied that the grain production around the world is just absolutely stupendous. And it makes me a little bit sad. In the central New South Wales at the moment the harvest has been going, there's been some absolutely extraordinarily high yields. But what makes me sad from that social point of view, just observing and hearing from people, is those people aren't doing cartwheels. You know, in the old days when it used to grow up, you know, if there was a big bonanza crop, that was the really exciting time in cropping and everything, because people could pay off debt, or, you know, buy the farm next door, or do whatever, new car, etc., etc. There was the excitement. Wow, this is going to push us forward. You're not even hearing that in the pub talk. So there is a description of, wow, that's really interesting, isn't it? If those folks aren't super happy with almost once in a generation seasonal conditions to give a super high yield, if that isn't kicking them really forward, then that's really showing we're starting to hit the ceiling, aren't we, in general as a systemic thing. So no-kill cropping relies on 5 principles. We'll just throw them out quickly, and then we'll go in and then think about them when we're able to look out through the sides of the tent here on what we're surrounded by, because this is essentially a modified naturalised grassland, okay? And so with a no-kill, sowing is done dry, right? So not wet sowing. It's done with a straight running coulter type equipment. So what I'm talking about is it's just cutting a slot. It is deliberately not disturbing the soil, okay? Yep. No. So the question was, is that like a tine? No, in fact, it's actually saying not. So as a principle, no, we're not going to drag tines through the ground. So when we look at what we're standing in here, if we think about tines are essentially like dragging a rake through this. And being very, very clear about this, it's not me saying tines are evil or you should never use tines. Disturbance as a thing is something we'll come back to. So it's a good question that we're aiming with no-kill to be as minimal disturbance as possible. If we could get a result without actually putting something into the ground, just spread the seed, right, we'd do that, okay? So straight running coulter equipment, so it's kind of scissoring through the grassland, right? I've yet to find a single plant that I've ever killed on the grassland with the right equipment. So not all discs are the same. There's probably about 110 different types of discs you can go and buy on the market at the moment. There's probably 5 or 6 that are suited to no-kill. Okay? And next principles are no chemicals. That's a simple one for you to understand, because we're about diversifying the grassland as much as possible. If we were to employ that tool, that would be simplifying it, suppressing it. Okay, so no-kill is wanting to expand the diversity. No fertiliser, because we're relying upon the landscape grassland functions to supply nutrients, and the operators on top of that nutrient supply are, of course, animals, which is where we'll get onto the behavioural stuff soon, because if we just let the animals do what they do, just like us, they are animals of habit, right? And they will over and underutilise parts of the landscape if we just let them do that, and those habits will repeat. Okay, and so that brings us on to the no fertiliser. And because, again, we're not seeking to change this grassland down to something that less than it can be, especially in the diversity sense. All right? Okay? And then the last principle is effective grazing management that returns nutrients. Because it couldn't operate as a system, essentially, or would actually operate at a stagnant lower rate if we just kept on cropping into a grassland and didn't have recycling of nutrients via those 4-legged compost heaps that we have walking around, right? Then we would not have as much nutrient flow. But something by giving the full range of diversity there is that every plant brings different nutrients at different times from different depths in different concentrations to the soil surface. And then we've got our 4-legged machines with mouths to go and recycle it, change it, make it plant available, and then spread it across the landscape. So that's a little bit of a straight in bang. There's the principles. So let's tease out some of them, okay, to make sense, because when we look at a grassland, your first reasonable question would be, well, wait a second, you're putting something in there with all these other 100 or more plants, because that's what I aim for, right? It's got to be, the field's got to be 100 or more plants is what I'm aiming for. Even if I miss a bit, there's still plenty of plants, all right? So we have to place the seed in dry. Okay, and that provides two main things there. You're putting it in ahead of the weed germinations, because predominantly the crops that we're sowing in this sort of a way are essentially annual weeds, aren't they? They're just annual weeds that us humans have been tinkering with for a fair while to make them more useful to us. But they're just annuals, okay? So the only advantage that your crop gets is the 10-metre head start on the 100-metre sprint, right? And that might be even enough to, if you, for the young ones in the room here, to outclass Usain Bolt, right? If you get enough of a head start, yeah? Right? So there's the key. It's not that you're getting rid of competition, but you're just giving it the early advantage. And that's the reason also why we wouldn't have just spread the seed. So back to your question there before about, what are we putting it in with? We're making as tiny a slot as possible. So we're really only looking at soil coverage. That's all. Putting it in dry. And there it is. It's sitting and waiting for water and conditions to germinate it. Just the same as if you put a seed in a dry pot of potting mix on your back veranda and leave it there until you add water, ready to go. Okay, so it's ahead of time. And the other thing there too is that we're going and travelling across the ground when the ground is at its strongest, okay, which is completely opposite to the way conventional systems are, because they're pretty much predicated on moist sowing. Just the time that the soil is able to be compacted the most, we put great big machines across the top of it. That's what we as humans have been doing for a fair while. And unfortunately, since the Second World War, this has been getting a bit worse, and there's been some studies, and you can Google this one up, that the impact of our modern machinery is actually worse than the dinosaurs walking around 65 million years ago, right? Comparatively, the machines have got larger, and yes, you might say, yeah, we've got some fatter tyres now and more tracks and everything, but their compressive force, especially at depth, right, is much worse than even the dinosaurs impacting the ground, which really, when you think fundamentally, that is something that we're not faced with as a feedback loop right now, because we're still growing crops over the top, but we're doing damage down at depths depending upon how far it is, of course, to your bedrock underneath, but at depths that you're probably never going to realistically be able to repair. There will be at great depths. So that changes the whole hydrology of an area and everything. We're actually teetering some things there with conventional systems. So there's making the point. We're travelling over the ground when it's at its greatest strength. So that has a bit of a real life impact as well. That this really feeds into, should be really a sixth principle, is you've got to keep it cheap, because if it wasn't cheap and you're producing less grain, well then there's not a business prospect for you, is it? That's not a proposition. Okay, so here's a comparison for you. When my son, who's got the whiz-bang GPS, I can't drive it on the tractor. I can drive it straight otherwise, but I can't operate all of that stuff, and the air seeder and so forth. He'll do 20 to 25 acres in the old terms per hour, sowing with that. He uses 14 litres per hour or less of fuel to sow that crop. When he hops in his Land Cruiser ute, he uses 18 litres an hour to drive to town. Okay, so it's really exciting from that point of view that that these straight running coulter equipment is, I would hope you can imagine, is just like towing a machine across the ground when it's at its strongest. Okay, so that's as much intervention over the top of the grassland as no kill is. So that's where it really gets very exciting, because the cost base of no kill is 10% or less of conventional in any area. That's just a rule of thumb you can take. Yep. So reasonable. Next question is, okay, well, you're doing this thing, Bruce. Well, how about the yields? Okay, yep. In once again, holding up my thumb, the thumbnail guide for you, depending which area we're talking about, is about a quarter to a third of what the conventional would be producing as far as grain yields go. Okay. Now let's talk about the rest of the grassland as far as yield goes, because we'll grow 30 to 40% more biomass over the year on that same paddock versus the conventional paddock next door, right? So we need to make money out of that, make a business. So that's where the livestock come in again. So it's not just the agronomic needs that are fed by having the livestock. It's the genuine business needs as well, because no use growing grass from a business point of view unless you can somehow make use of it in an economic sense. So that's where the animals come in as well. But think about how this operates, especially in areas where our wheat zone gets a bit fluky or a bit hard, right? On the edge of the wheat zone, where it's dry and arid, as an example, right? Maybe you get a crop or maybe you don't. That's where people, tend to lose a lot of money, of course, because keep trying and then your luck's not with you, you don't get the ears and so forth. You can go and put this at ultra low cost and go cropping there, but you've still got the mainstay of the grazing return. You're not going backwards at all, right, by putting it in. So that's where it really works very well in that sort of situation. And then where you do have topography and that sort of thing, right, it's an ideal fit there wherever you can get the machinery reasonably, because you're not putting the soil at any erosion risk at all by sowing a crop. So no-kill in of itself starts to expand the possibilities of us collectively growing heaps more grain, right, for our human needs, but doing it in an ecological fashion that means that it can actually be doing that permanently, okay, forever, because we have still got the grassland function going there, okay? So we're not putting any of our soil resources at risk by doing this, and as long as you keep it cheap, because there's always that tendency for people to go out and spend money on shiny machinery or spend too much on the neighbour with their contracting rates and that sort of thing, and then be disappointed, well, I didn't produce much grain, but I spent a lot of money, right? Well, don't spend a lot of money. So no-kill fits from a lot of perspectives here, and the bigger worldwide and more larger landscape prospect I put there too is that we actually can be active in saving extinctions before they actually come. So what I mean by that is some of the most threatened ecosystems we have are in fact grasslands that have existed in cropping areas, right? Because those areas have just been put wide scale to crop. And if you go anywhere, at least in the Australian context, in the wheat sheep zone, it's very, very rapidly becoming the cereal growing zone. It's not a combination zone anymore. Just go out and drive around and you see a paucity of animals, but then also biologically think that's really becoming quite a desert, quite a really, really big barrier for any animals to adapt in the landscape, changing to changes in climate or even just seasonal things. We're actually ensuring that we're making more and more isolated islands for the animals not to go through. And, us humans usually visualise and see the animals on top of the ground, but it's all the underground biota, isn't it, right, that will need to migrate and always has throughout our history. So if we can reinstate grasslands, we are reinstating a really, really broader, really big ecological foundation that at the moment is just being decimated and torn up. So that's all about us having systemic change, an alternative system to operate, right? So I'm very much not the zealot here saying everywhere should be no kill and we shouldn't have intensive agriculture, because intensity is only related to how often it's repeated. It's some great speakers here this morning on the vegetable issues, and there's one of them there. Thank you very much. Absolutely excellent presentation. And a lot of what they were dealing with was, in fact, how much disturbance, how often, right? And if you're doing your grazing management, it's the same question. How often do I put a disturbance with grazing animals across the top? Same question if we looked at fire, right? How often can we apply a disturbance tool, right, and still keep function at its highest? Right? If we talk about fire as an example of just thinking about that, a hot fire, how often do you put it through any sort of a landscape and you start to see the landscape degrade, right? Every so often, in a patchy way, that actually brings more biodiversity to that landscape than less, of course. And we've had 47,000 years of that being practiced on this continent. So there's the deal. How much disturbance do we want to put in? It's up to you, right? But if we do disturbance, whatever you regrow, especially in the broadacre sense, needs to greatly outweigh your disturbance, and how often. So if we used something such as deep ripping as an example and everything, how often would you deep rip through the soil before you destroy all the possibilities of widespread mycorrhiza? Of course, you disturb it straight away, don't you? Right? You've broken all those strands. If you don't let it regrow, then it's not going to be able to function. So with no kill and 10 minutes, thank you. Good. I'll bring it around just and make a mention of some of the things there on your paper. How this all comes into the broader work of self-herding and animal behaviour stuff that I'm involved in as well is that, quite simply, the larger the scale that we're talking about, and think about paddock size and that sort of thing, the more that inherent habits over and underutilise the landscape with animals, right? And if we let them do their thing, why wouldn't those habits just keep repeating? They do. Just the same, we're creatures of habit as well. So you can take an active role in changing that so that you better redistribute the animal products and impact, right? Because we usually only use one word, grazing, but that's describing three things, isn't it? It's consumption, it's impaction, and then deposition out the back end. All three of those things aren't being evenly applied on your paddocks, I guarantee that, right? So if we change that, then that gives us an opportunity to change the fertility rate on your paddocks, which feeds into a no-kill cropping enterprise, but sits just beautifully on the grazing management thing. You might be able to find that instead of putting up an extra fence to get the result, you change the behaviour and you don't have to spend money on that non-renewable investment that you've spent money on, right, and get that same result. So that's the exciting bit of the animal behaviour stuff. And so I should, because we're starting to clock down now towards finish, I should open up, instead of just being a straight yap at you here, for questions and or comments. 20 minutes. Okay. Tons of time, but let's welcome that even more to tease out some of those things that have done. And probably I should mention too, there's some on the sheets that you've been given. On our own place, we're in our search for diversity, we've planted a couple of 100,000 trees and over 350,000 shrubs. We're involved in the CSIRO Enrich project. And if you ever want to Google that up, that's a good one in terms of forage and supplies for livestock, because that brought all the Australian forage shrubs into a test program. So a previous speaker was talking about different compounds and how they exhibit in the animals. It makes sense to all of us, I would hope, that of course the more diverse that we have the landscape, the more that the steak off that animal is different than one that if we just have them on ryegrass and lucerne or something. You've got a different product in the end, haven't you? Okay, we don't tend to do that with grains, do we? There's virtually no local provenance of grains, is there? People marketing, it's none. They'll try with this or that. That's a key point that I'll put forward for the grassland grains system for local farmers to actually go and grow grain in complex surroundings, so they've actually got a point of difference in the long run. The grain that's produced off something as complex as that is totally different than if we ploughed it up. It will have measurably different things, but as well, it'll have all those unmeasurable things. The same way as the phytochemicals that come through wine, people can discern, a difference, or, I like it or I don't like it, right? That's all of the other small stuff that's embedded in that. So if we want to provide a more nutritious product, we can now have the potential of growing it in complex surroundings, but then there's a business proposition there too. You've actually got something that's different than all of the other grains in that huge pile of stuff down at the silo. Your stuff is suddenly different. So it's a little bit more like, you can go commercial cattle breeding, or you could breed stud cattle. Totally your choice, isn't it? Grain should be the same. But if your grain is the same as everybody else's because you've grown it in a monoculture, why shouldn't it be in the same pile? Might have a bit more or less of protein or some other measurable, but largely it's the same stuff. So we're not making that difference. So questions or comments?
With the preparation prior to sowing, when you say the ground's at strongest, I assume you mean the driest, because the hand weight, so you get the highest vegetation load often at the same time, or partially in phase 3. So what sort of vegetation are you looking at when you're sowing into this ground? How do you manage it?
Okay, yes, and I'll just, for the sake of the video, just see if I can repeat this properly. So pre-sowing preparation, how much material can you handle and go through, and what's appropriate? Okay, yep. So two different things there. What do we want from the cycling ecological side? How much do we want immediately cycling by a pre-grazing event, whether that be laid down, whether it be consumed? Two different pathways there. And then how much can the machinery get through? That's the other practicality, isn't it? So let's start with the second one. Get straight running coulter equipment, and you'll go through anything. If you provided the residue of a half-eaten round bale there, it'll go through that. So that's why I mentioned before that there's probably about half a dozen units on the market that will suit no-kill out of the huge range. A disc unit isn't just a disc unit. There's a bit of subtlety and knowledge needed here before just charge out with a disc machine that's inappropriate and say, couldn't get through it, couldn't do it. So the pre-preparation with animals, we sow in front of the animals, behind the animals, while the animals are in the paddock, your choice. If you've got machinery that can do it, then that's fine. If you think about a whole farm basis, and make it very, very simplistic, that we're just rotating around a farm, and you're not intending to come back to that paddock that you're just going out of with the livestock until it's regrown, why not get some seed in the ground, right? That's where it really perfectly fits into an existing rotational situation.
Would this year be, if it was a bit drier, would this become the perfect sort of seed bed?
It's to me showing still a lot of moisture at the top.
Yes. If it was drier, is it sort of about the right quantity of feed?
Oh, right. Okay. So the question is the right quantity to go through? Is that for the?
Well, and if the grass was if we were looking out there, that's standing up, so it would make it harder for a seed to germinate. We would ideally want it down a little bit like this.
Well, yes and no. So the question, do we want it high or low? So when we look out the window here, right at this moment, if we sow into there, let's just presume for a moment it isn't wet at the top, because if we do wet sowing, right, then the seed will germinate, right, and or rot. So we're not doing that. Yep. So, but as far as material, if that was all just pretty much dry and not doing anything, straight into that. With the right equipment, it doesn't matter how high, if you can imagine a large phalaris patch or anything like that. No, you can just sail straight through because you're putting in something there that's occupying a slightly different ecological niche than the things that are there. And again, it's in those windows where the other active, really good sprinters, as far as plants go, aren't ahead of the game. They haven't already got the head start, right? Well, you're behind the game. And it leads us to that systemic thing. If we think about all existing cropping systems other than no-kill, they're pretty much based on a moist soil application. When it rains, you beauty will put the seed in the ground, get something growing. That always means you're going to have to do something about weeds because they've got the head start, right? It isn't, a value judgment of saying that's wrong or bad. It's just an inevitable consequence of not having something in there that has the head start. And so we're, if you like, already forced down a track. If we have machinery that can't operate unless it's moist, right? Well, we are still trapped in a set of systems that we will need to do something about the competitors because we won't get a result or an uneven result.
Do you ever coat the seed in a biological something or other?
Right, do I, so the question, do I ever coat the seed in biologicals? We don't bother. And it's sort of one of those things again too that just like the question on say fertiliser, well you don't use fertiliser but could you, would you? I'd say to you, yeah, you can. You can choose for that, but we just recognise what are we putting on that seed to get that result. And if especially you get a thumbs up from me if it's cheap and you see an effect. Well then, good. It's good for your business and good for you, and something's happening. Do we need to understand more about the science on that? That would be great if a researcher did that. But if you're getting the result, then that's fine. But oftentimes with cropping systems, the costs, of course, are loaded up front. So you think about in a standard cropping system and everything, huge cost up front, especially if they've gone and killed out everything in the field over the summertime. And then they applied fertiliser and spent a lot on diesel because they're dragging stuff through the ground, etc. All of those things. It's a huge cost already. What choice do you have? You've given yourself a very limited economic choice. You need a large yield to get out of that situation. So I'll give you a figure in kilos per hectare of how low you could have at current prices if we're talking just oats. So, and this would be in our part of the world. So it's about 200 kilos per hectare is the break even, not only of sowing, but of harvesting at current prices. Oats go back down to their, lesser price, like a couple of years ago or something like that. The break even point would be 400 kilos per hectare. But that's a ridiculously tiny amount. Ask any regular cropper that question. Is usually not measured that way. How much of a tonnage do I need to cover everything that I've put in there ahead of time? So don't ever blame people for doing stuff if they're in a situation that then, I have to do this or I have to do that because we've already made a commitment. So that's once again from the business point of view, the difficulty with current cropping situations. And one of the things that I mentioned before about, they're not doing cartwheels with once in a generation yields. Wow, that's really showing a really high cost base. Must be. Yes?
Can you just explain what you mean by a head start with those seeds? Why aren't there other seeds that are in there that are getting the same head start?
Yes, so with the head start with the seed that we're putting in the ground, and there's everything else there that, why isn't it getting a head start? It's back to disturbance. So our disturbance on the whole landscape is a series of slots like that. And so it's like having we're crushing a little bit of soil. So it's perfect seed soil contact as soon as you get moisture. It's protected from above ground predators of that seed, whether that be ants or birds or whatever, right? Because you've just covered it. So just add water and then it's bang, it's off to the head start. So that's what you'll very, very typically find, especially with cereals. They'll be up like this, and then the competitor other annual plants will be just germinating. So that's where they're going. From then on, it's a race. Yeah.
I'm just interested, how is this different to what we've always known as sod seeding? So going into pasture with a sod seeder to increase the seed.
Yeah, so how is this different than sod seeding? In some elements, same deal, but the dry part of principle is a really big deal, and then having machinery that can do that, because plenty of the sod seeders are quite effective with low pressures to get into moist soil, but can't get any penetration or not sufficient penetration for no kill. So that sort of once again limits the models that you can go. So yeah, essentially it's the same. If you think back, lots of people who would have rejuvenated or old loosened pastures that were cutting out and that sort of thing, and they'd oversow with a cereal for a year or two, get another year or two out of it. And that should bring me to mentioning another thing too. If we go and sow into what you're seeing out there, okay, and we add a high nutrient, low toxin plant in amongst all of that other, you've just changed the whole smorgasbord for the animals. It isn't just about we have grown this much extra biomass on what we've sown, because they are going to dietary mix that with the other things. So that changes the whole consumption of your animals across a landscape. So in areas that you have, say, things like shrub encroachment or other weeds that, and what's a weed? It's just a plant we don't like, but that's all right, we're humans. You can be applying that and not creating the conditions for that weed to further encroach because you're not disturbing. Right, but you're giving the animals a chance to do even more dietary mixing than they could before, not only from the nutrient side, but the proximity. Like having a, eating competition, but the water is up there 100 metres and a butter's down there. Your consumption is limited, but when we bring it all together, then it's heightened. So, yep.
I wondered if you'd had any success with non-cereal crops, things other than cereals.
Oh yes, okay, yes. So have what sort of range of crops have been sown with no kill? So the range of cereals is one. Summer crops such as sorghum and lab, cowpeas, millet. Millet and oats are two just good indicators for summer and winter options, just because they're cheap, okay, relative, and give you a lot of carbohydrate as an initial point. Lucerne, kikuyu, phalaris, what else? Buffalo grass. So we've got a range there of cooler growing species. All the medics, barrel medics, subclovers. So it's a fair range. The applicability is in your area, whatever annuals or things that can grow in your area, well, you can do it with this. Yeah, yep. Mm-hmm.
And
Do you mix the...
or would you grow, a whole range of, or do you just have...
Generally, what we do is, the question is, do you sow a mix of things or sow one thing? We tend to sow one thing because there's a commercial imperative here, but the biological thing is, if we've got 100 plants, I could add a mixed species of 4 or 5. Well, that's great percentage-wise, right? But it's not that big a deal, is it, in the total? But it's then at the limitation that if we've got to separate that all out, that's a bigger cost, and we don't have a uniform product to sell. So it's not downplaying that mixed species stuff can be very useful, but coming from ground zero, if you add five species, well then of course percentage wise that's huge. That's much better than one species at a time. But in the vegetable sense too, you've got to think about principles. You can do it over a time series as well. So if we're going into that grassland, well, this year it can be oats, the next season it could be lupins, or it could, and then a canola or whatever, and you can do still a rotational thing over the top, but because we are not disturbing and also not taking off a large nutrient load off to sell, right, we've actually got a system that can be done every year. We're actually quite differently escaping out of what we would normally have to do in conventional things, where we would need to rotate because you're doing one or only several things, and then you're doing the next several things, and that's why you need to rotate. So there is some diversity. So, yep. Sorry. Yep.
I mentioned there's a fair bit of quite a few seasons where there's a lot of weed growth. How do you manage that at harvest?
Yeah, great question. So contamination at harvest time, when you've got all the other material. So I should say, we've grown crops above my shoulder of oats, but then also I've grown them this high as well. So yeah, when you have the seasons that provide a lot of material, it is a secondary sorting after the harvester has taken it off, but that is really, really high value stuff. If you put that in front of animals, it's quite spectacular that they'll just gorge themselves on this stuff. You do have to do that reasonably soon, because you think about all of that material in a silo. Some of that, if it's a wet spring, can be quite green and moisture laden and everything like that. And the little six-legged foragers that are in the silos, they love to get into that stuff very, very quickly. So it's a quick separation, but it's valuable material. It's not just chaff, it's super good stuff. And even one of the brewers that we've worked with in the past, Wildflower Brewery, keeps on wanting us to supply him with more of that, because it's different every year. It's never the same stuff. Yep. So yes. Okay. Thank you.
Bruce, can you give us an example of how you're changing animal behaviour?
Right. So a quick example of how we're doing it, and you can find the book, self-herding book. It's for free online there for you. Just Google that up. So the biggest and most fascinating work we're doing at the moment is out in the rangelands, because it has a big effect. So we can signal animals to occupy different parts of the landscape and essentially apply rotational grazing without putting up wire and water, getting them to choose to come to the signals. So if that sort of doesn't make sense, we're not leading them around by the nose, but it's more like what we're creating there is an addictive habit, just the same as somebody returning to the poker machine and wanting to press the button. We're doing the same with the animals, and then what we're finding is those, even in subsequent years, they revisit those spots. So we've changed the whole grazing dynamics over areas, and in these smaller areas, just like you'd imagine more rough country and that sort of thing, where it's going to be impossible to either be up there as a shepherd or apply fences and so forth, then you can use self-herding to manipulate them out of the landscape and also bring them out as well, save yourself the mustering time. So thank you very much for it all, team, and look forward to seeing you through the day.
Thank you so much, Bruce. That was a mic drop of a final answer. That was great.